Hello, everybody. Thank you so very much for coming. I've wanted to give this talk for quite a while, but because it's such a sensitive subject, I've refrained a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and throw it out there today. What this is basically based on is part of a movement in sociology that I'm a part of. It is basically taking a look at racism and says maybe it's time to go back and redefine what we think exactly is involved with this concept and its consequences for the larger society. Now, what I did up there, and I apologize for my students for committing that atrocious act of going to Wikipedia for information, but in this case, it kind of works pretty well because it kind of shows us this old way of thinking about racism. What it does is that basically all these definitions, when it kind of goes in the circle, is pointing out these two main aspects of what racism entails. The first one is kind of not liking somebody or disliking somebody, even hating somebody, just on the basis of primarily skin color. Now, the other part of that involves what often results from that type of thinking, which is this discrimination that creates these massive amounts of racial inequalities in our society. Now, this definition, it worked really well back in the 1950s and 1960s when there was, a cause and effect, a means end type action where this, hatred of a race of people thinking that they were racially inferior really did directly result in the segregation, Jim Crow South, and all these inequalities that we see before us. However, since then, our society has done a really good job, I'll go ahead and say that, of kind of undermining the first half of this definition. This notion that one race of people is inferior to another or just hating somebody because of their skin color, it's almost a social taboo at this point. It is not widely tolerated or widely accepted in our society. However, we're not doing so well on the second side of it because we still see what we call this new racism, which in a more subtle, discrete way is still creating these massive amounts of racial inequality. I pulled some quick numbers just as a survey to kind of let you know what I'm talking about. And because, I can be honest with you, some of my newspaper fans, the critics of my writing, they always accuse me of manipulating statistics, so I left these in their raw form. It makes them a little harder to read, but that way you can't say I messed with these census numbers at all. Right here we have the real median household income by race going the whole way back to 1967, and we see that gap between whites and Hispanics and blacks has remained, pretty relatively constant since the 1960s. So we haven't really seen much change in terms of that inequality. This is the people in poverty. It compares 2008 to 2009. And if you look down at those 2009 numbers, you see the poverty rate is for whites about 12%, a little upper. That's actually a historic high as we've seen it. But for blacks and Hispanics, we have over twice that rate. Almost a quarter of the folks that categorize themselves in this race or by these races live in poverty. Here's the unemployment numbers, which are a huge deal right now. And if you go back, this shows everything for the last year, but even just scanning down the column of January, you see the white rate is about 8%. The Hispanic and Latino rate, those two categories combined, is about 4 points higher. And then for the black unemployment rate, we're about twice that at 16%. Here's another big issue that's tied up with all this, especially because we're in the heart of getting college degrees right now. You can see we've done quite a bit bringing racial minorities into higher education since 1970, but if you still scan across that bottom row there in 2009 and looking at the proportion of folks of different races with bachelor's degrees, you still see all other races are much far behind the about third of whites that have it, with Hispanics even falling behind blacks in that number. And this is increasingly a big deal because these numbers are just, it seems like every year we get a report out and they just keep compounding. This has to do with incarceration rates. And this table is very, very tricky to read because it breaks things down by age also. But if we just say, look at that top column of all ages, if we look amongst men, we primarily see this because it's mostly men who go to prison, we see 1 in 21 black men is incarcerated versus 1 in 136 of white men, and we see an accelerated rate amongst Hispanics. So the question is, what is creating all these numbers today? And what I want to kind of point out is that it's not so much this outright hatred that creates these numbers anymore. It's a much, much more subtle phenomenon. It's kind of loosely based in these quiet prejudices that we oftentimes engage with without even us knowing it in many cases. So what I've done is I pulled a bunch of examples of what we could kind of maybe call racial incidents in our society that happened about the last 5 years. And we could kind of take a look at what happened and assess, what are we jumping at, what are we criticizing as a society, and what are we ignoring as a society, and at least in terms of perpetuating those inequalities I just lined out, what's actually going on here. So this first example I have is probably a very, very egregious example of what we would call, old-style classic racism, with the dirty words that are thrown out in extreme anger. For those of you who aren't familiar with this is Michael Richards. He played Kramer on Seinfeld, and he was doing a stand-up act in Los Angeles, and he was being heckled by some black folks in the audience. He didn't take it so well, and this is how he ultimately reacted. Okay, so that's what he went and did and went on this, and as we can see by the next little video we're not going to watch, talking about him being put on trial, there were some pretty massive consequences to his career for doing this. In fact, it's never really recovered ever since, because he definitely has a stigma on himself for doing this. So that's, the good way our society has reacted to this point. We no longer tolerate things like this, and there are severe consequences for people throughout these awful, terrible words and so forth. And here's where sometimes I kind of maybe feel like a little bit of a hypocrite, because I can never know what it's like to be called a word like this. I mean, I'm called a lot of things, for those of you who know me, but these words don't really apply to me. So I don't want to undermine that experience and how utterly awful it must feel. But at the same time, in terms of the way our larger society works these days, it's not really so much these ideas that are creating these racial inequalities anymore. It's something else we should take a little bit closer look at. Or here's another kind of well-known example where the actor Mel Gibson had a similar incident where he's being arrested by a cop, or a police officer, I'm sorry, who ended up being Jewish, and he kind of went on an anti-Semitic tirade. And right after he did this, the movie he had just produced ended up bombing. And again, his career hasn't really recovered. And I guess somebody told me earlier today this was compounded by some other racial epithets thrown out on a tape about his daughter or something I didn't quite follow, but apparently he's a repeat offender along these lines. But again, we got to ask ourselves, is this the actual stuff that's reproducing those differential numbers we see in education, incarceration, and poverty, and so forth? So we can start here to kind of pull these apart through this example, where a radio talk show host called Don Imus, he made these incredibly racially insensitive remarks, and also sexist, as a matter of fact, about the Rutgers basketball team a few years ago. And I want to watch this little clip from Fox News, because it both shows what had happened and also some of the social reaction to what he did.
Our top story tonight, the whole country is buzzing following Don Imus' comments on the radio show about the Rutgers University women's basketball team. Imus apologized for the comments after on his radio show this morning.
I'm sorry I did it. I'm embarrassed that I did it.
Reverend Al Sharpton's radio program to explain himself and made some more comments that some people say could be just as bad as the original one.
It's like the old country song, God may forgive you, but I won't. Jesus may love you, but I don't. So I can't get any place with you people, but I can get something with Jesus. Who are these people, Mr. You know, and this one I'm talking to.
And just a short time ago, CBS Radio announced that Imus has in fact been suspended from his radio show for 2 weeks. Also, NBC News suspended their television simulcast of Imus' program. President of NBC, Steve Hattis, released the following statement. Quote, beginning Monday, April 16th, MSNBC will suspend simulcasting the syndicated Imus in the Morning radio program for 2 weeks. Now, this comes after careful consideration in the days since his racist, abhorrent comments were made. Now, Don Imus has expressed profound regret and embarrassment and has made a commitment to listen to all of those who have raised legitimate expressions of outrage. In addition, his dedication, in his words, to change the discourse on his program moving forward has confirmed for us that this action is appropriate. Our future relationship with Imus is contingent on his ability to live up to his word. Join us.
Okay, now not once again to undermine, and I hate, setting something as egregious as these words aside that he said, both in reference to African Americans and women in general. We should also ask ourselves, though, is this playing a large role in perpetuating those numbers I just talked about, or in what may be the first time I agree with Sean Hannity, was there something to note about maybe what he said in the follow-up is just as problematic in terms of you people, I can't get anywhere with you. Because what that kind of represents is a larger prejudices of some group as antagonistic no matter what. It's dividing a line. It's pushing a division between black and white that ultimately reinforces what we're going to see in a second. First you get the division, then you start to get differences, then you start to get differences that are categorized, and that's, before you know it, you start having this racial perception of hierarchies, and that's where we start to get some of these numbers. So here's another incident that's, this is just kind of a mess. We'll go ahead and watch this. This was Senator George Allen from Virginia a few years ago when he was running for president, and he made a off-color remark to somebody working on his rival campaign, Senator Jim Webb, and we're going to see what happened in this instance.
Senator Allen, you too have gotten in trouble with words that you uttered. Let me bring it back to August 11th. You were at campaign stop, and a young man who was videotaping for the web campaign was there also.
There's no idea what the young kid or not or whatever his name is. He's going on let's get along with not here.
And here's the young man, F.R. Cigar. He's a resident of Virginia, an American citizen, straight-A student at Fairfax High School, and I was at the University of Virginia. Critics say that McCarthy is a racist slur, and that he used it because he was dark-skinned. What did you specifically mean when you said, welcome to America and the real Virginia? Why did you use those words for a dark-skinned American?
Tim, I made a mistake. I said things thoughtlessly, and I apologize for it as well I should. But there was no racial or ethnic intent to slur anyone. If I had any idea that word, and to some people in some parts of the world was an insult, I would never do it because it's contrary to what I believe or who I am. I just made up. Made up word. Never heard before. Never heard. What did you mean? And if I did, honestly, if I thought that was slurring anyone based on their ethnicity or their race or their religion, I would never do it. It's not who I am. It's not how I was.
Why don't you say to someone, welcome to America, welcome to the real Virginia?
So this is a very, very interesting case because first we have this kind of lesser-known epithet thrown out there of macaca, and he said he made it up, which is interesting, and it makes up words that are in common usage in other places. But that is, of course, what everybody ultimately looked at and really, really reacted strongly to. It was that word, and as you see at the bottom part of what this article describes, it is truly recognized that this incident is when he started dropping in the polls, and it's probably this incident that ultimately cost him not just the Senate seat, but he was also a leading presidential contender contender to run this year. So we see, once again, we have a strong social reaction to words like this to the point where it ruins senators' careers when they make off-kilter comments like that. And like I said, I don't want to undermine the horrific hurt these comments have, but when we compare that comment back to that other line he made there about this welcome to the America, welcome to the real Virginia, which the late Tim Russert was pressing him on, we should probably ask what the effect is of constructing somebody like that, of constructing somebody purely on the basis of their skin color by ascribing them as if they're foreign, as if they're exotic, as if they are what he's probably getting around to, not one of us. And that's these ideas that start to creep up, that starts to reinforce these systems of prejudices, which we'll see by the end of this discussion, ultimately have a lot more to do with perpetuating those inequalities and those numbers I showed you earlier than a word directed at a cameraman, which I made as awful, and probably especially awful coming from your senator. I can't imagine that. I had a congressman call me a terrorist sympathizer one time, and that felt pretty bad, but this is probably much, much worse. Okay, and we also need to take a quick look at this incident because it is also at work in a new kind of politics that's slowly emerging that is ultimately going back to influence those numbers I showed you at the beginning of the speech. Okay, this is Bill Clinton, and obviously, as being known as the first black president before we elected an actual black president, we can't really ever consider him being a racist. And yeah, so that's why it's kind of funny I put him up there. But same thing, we should kind of take a look at what those comments ultimately meant, or what he actually meant when he was talking about the victory Obama had here in the South Carolina primary, where he said, oh, Jesse Jackson won this state twice. Because if you actually sit back and look at the logic of that argument, basically he is saying, oh, Obama's a fringe candidate, Obama can't beat my wife, Obama definitely can't win the presidency, maybe Obama should just give up. Or something like that may be the rationale behind this. And that's where we can start understanding how these ideas start getting transformed into other ideas that can ultimately start creating some of these massive amounts of inequalities. Or another example from our state that I dug up, this is our new governor, and we see a local senator I'm not actually familiar with. If you read down the second paragraph there, he was cited as saying we have one quote-unquote raghead in the White House, we don't need another one in the governor's mansion. Now, obviously, that is just a horrific, awful remark, and people jumped on it pretty quickly, and we did not stand for that. And I don't know if he received any formal sanctions or not, but we did ultimately see her prevail in the governor's race. But at the same time, this construction of whatever was meant by that word, maybe we should put it in comparison to another incident that popped up referring to a similar group of people, and then kind of assess which one of these statements is more likely to have these consequences in terms of creating numbers, the racial inequality numbers that we talked about a few seconds ago.
So where I am, well, I think to say this, I want to take a look at it. I think you're right. I think the political correctness can lead to some kind of paralysis when we don't address reality. I mean, look, Bill, I'm not a big the kind of books I've written about the civil rights movement in this country, but when I get on a plane, I got to tell you, if I see people who are in Muslim garb, and I think, they're identifying themselves first and foremost as Muslims, I get worried, I get nervous.
Okay, this was Juan Williams, and this was an especially interesting case because, as he just pointed out in that little speech there with Bill O'Reilly, he is a civil rights, well, I don't know if we call him a scholar, but he was very committed to describing and celebrating what that movement did. But he did make these comments about being afraid when he gets on a plane and he sees someone's in Muslim garb, or presumably someone with brown skin who is a Muslim garb. So while he didn't use that word or a racial epithet that refers to what people wear in their heads, rags or whatnot, at the same same time, if we can think about the larger consequences of these ideas of it's okay to be afraid of that person because they are like other people who might hurt us. As you know, as little of a worry that actually is, what it does is reinforce this construction of all Muslims, e.g. all brown people, coming to kill us with suicide bombers or as ultrally violent because of their religion and so forth. And these ideas, as we've seen, let's say the last week we see the protests in Egypt, those ideas are very, very much part of this larger conversation we see taking place in cable news right now about whether or not Islamic people can rule themselves democratically. I really don't see how that is any different than the contemporary version of what we used to call the white man's burden 200 years ago. So this is where these ideas, they start to get caught up in people, and the next thing you know, they get embedded into our politics, and they can have severe, severe, severe consequences in this case, or in the case of Egypt, in terms of international politics. So that's another way we got to watch out for these constructs of other people as violent, dangerous, coming to get you, be afraid. Oh, and by the way, by your being afraid, we should oppress and marginalize. So that's another way these subtle ideas can start to work in to our actions in ways we may not really recognize or implicitly accept as going on because they're just so ingrained to how we see the world. This is another example I pulled from a radio talk show host. It's interesting because once again we have this point where she used the N-word, and that's what everybody started to focus in and really, really say that was wrong, that was bad. But if you listen to her argument, there's actually some other ideas she expresses that are much, much more problematic in terms of the way we relate to people, or the way people of different races relate to each other.
The controversy began during Dr. Lord's radio show on Tuesday. An African-American caller named Jay said she was offended by comments made by friends of her white husband, leading Schlesinger to bring up what she felt was a double standard when it comes to the N-word.
You turn on HBO, listen to a black comic, and all you hear is I don't get it. If anybody around my house and says it's a horrible thing.
The discussion quickly became an argument.
I can't believe what I hear on the radio. We're not there for I don't even heard it.
Well, I did, and I'll say it again. Is what you hear on HB. If you're that hypersensitive about color and don't have a sense of humor, don't marry out of your race.
This week, the day after her N-word rant, she apologized.
I didn't intend to hurt me. I was attempting to make a philosophical point, and I articulated the N-word all the way out. More than one time. And that was wrong.
Still, some tonight, including the Reverend Al Sharpton, are calling on advertisers to rethink their support of her show. Her production company tells CBS News her advertisers know this was an anomaly and they know she's not a racist. Schlesinger, it would seem, hopes her 9 million weekly visitors agree. Jeff for CBS News, New York.
Okay, so here once again we see the use of that word, which in terms of the old racism is very, very, quintessential. It's just that outright expression of hatred. And once again, we see it here used in a situation where somebody is angry, which pops up all too often. So it's used with the intent to harm. And I'd never want to, undermine how awful that word is. In any case, we use it, or not we use it, but in any case it is used. It's awful. It should probably just go away. But this other comment that was kind of embedded in there, if you're that hypersensitive about racial jokes, don't marry somebody outside of your own race. Not that the jokes are bad or the jokes shouldn't happen in the first place. We see this comment of, well, if you don't have a sense of humor, don't marry somebody outside your race. This is, at least in terms of practical differences, no different than the laws that kept people of different races from legally not getting married to each other 100 years ago. At least in terms of the consequences, in terms of the ultimate outcome, it really is the same, these ideas like that. So here we see these ideas can get embedded in our behaviors and start to drive these wedges between people, which is in many cases the first step towards insensitivity and more prejudices. A few other things we can kind of pop up to really start to crystallize how this ultimately works. Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, an interview popped up with him he'd done a few years ago where he was talking about then Senator Barack Obama when he was running for the White House, and we see here he used the notion of no Negro dialect. Now, when this happened, especially his Senate opponent at the time, Sharon Angle, she really jumped on this word and started to really criticize him for using that outdated language to describe somebody of another race. And that probably wasn't the best way to phrase it or appropriate. But if we look into the larger sense of his argument, or if we look here of this larger idea that because he is quote-unquote light-skinned and because he doesn't talk like many people think black people talk or whatever is going on here, this would ultimately not hurt his presidential bid. But of course, implicit in that argument was if he was darker skinned, if he did talk slightly differently, then he wouldn't be ready for president. Okay, and we can probably think of this happening in 1,000 places of employment across the country every single day, or 1,000 different schools every single day. This same idea, this notion that a racial minority who shines is somehow an exception to the rule, this can start to reinforce the system of prejudices where we should probably step back and take a look as to whether or not these prejudicial assumptions that all this is based on are actually at play, or if they're actually true, which in many cases they're utter falsehoods. We see down here another interesting example that popped up, one of these racial incidents that happened from Joe Biden back when we were competing for the Democratic nomination, where he said he was described Barack Obama as the first mainstream African-American who was articulate, bright, clean, and a nice-looking guy. This one is also worth taking a closer look at and the context it came out of.
We begin here this evening with NBC Senior Reporter.
Good evening, and as you know, Senator Biden has long bid for the White House on the issue of Iraq. As you mentioned today, the campaign was sidetracked over the issue of race.
Like everybody these days, Biden declared online, but it was old media that got him in trouble. Personal comments he made about another White House official, Senator Barack Obama, reported by a reporter for the New York Observer.
And we got the first sort of mainstream African American who was articulate and bright and clean, nice-looking guy. That's a story.
Okay, so in that comment there, where he says Barack Obama is, so exceptional because he's bright, clean, and articulate, of course, implicit in that argument it is that many other people of the race he was identified are not bright, clean, and articulate. And of course, if we can think of that widespread prejudice being reinforced by the man who is now Vice President of the United States, if we can kind of think of how that idea could get ingrained into the discourse out there, and how, let's say, somebody might think if an African-American family starts to move in next door, or maybe somebody's thinking about opening up a business in an African-American neighborhood, we could see how this prejudice might direct them from doing that. So that is where these ideas can start to result in behaviors that ultimately manifest themselves in those horrific numbers of the poverty and the education and the jobs that I talked about a few seconds ago. I also want to turn attention real quick here to another recent phenomenon that we're calling Southern Strategy 2.0. If y'all aren't regular, or if you're not familiar with the first Southern Strategy, it was used in the late 1960s and 1970s here in the South. It was used by the Republican Party to where they drove a racial wedge between whites and blacks in an effort to accelerate the voter maybe like excitement to get white folks out to the polls, and that was the way they went about winning elections, was rather than, you know, appealing to all voters, they drove a racial wedge in order to make white folks afraid, in order to make white folks think as if something was taken from them, going to be taken from them. That's how they are electorally successful in this region for so long. What we're starting to call this is Southern Strategy 2.0. It's not based just on a black-white division, but we're starting to see a lot more races kind of be drawn into this idea that the racial other, there's something to fear, so stay away, and so forth. We see in this article right here, the Arizona governor who was embroiled in this very, very bitter controversy about whether or not an immigration law she had passed had racial components to it. I wrote a piece where I kind of said, you know, maybe we shouldn't focus so much on the law itself. We should kind of step back and take a look at this larger political context that law is coming out of. And the most egregious thing she ever said, basically saying all these Mexican drug lords, or I don't even know what the actual word she was, they were cutting people's heads off and leaving them out in the desert. It was a fabrication, and she did ultimately back off. But as we've seen this little bit of a clip I have here, she's still kind of reinforcing these stereotypes to use for political gain.
How bad, from your perspective, Phoenix is the kidnapping capital of the country, how bad is it for many people that don't live in Florida State?
Well, you know, we have a terrible situation, and the biggest fear, of course, are the drug cartels. We want our border secure. If the federal government would step up and do their job, do their responsible job of securing our border, we would not be faced with this. We cannot sustain the outrageous costs that it's costing us here in the state, education, healthcare, and incarceration. We cannot tolerate it. And then we're very concerned about the drug cartels and the spillovers. We have dropouts in our communities, affecting everybody, you know, that happen to be living in those neighborhoods. It's, you know, it's unfortunate, and it's unfair.
Okay, so what is actually going on in Arizona right now is we actually have a decline in immigration, both legal and illegal, if that word is in fact appropriate. And at the same time, we have a massive decline in crime rates. But as these things are declining, we have the politics of the state just becoming very, 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 very focused in on this notion of people of a different skin color coming to be violent, coming to sell your children drugs. And then the new thing that seems to be popping up in here is now we tend to be scapegoating this group as the source of why the schools are bankrupt and why there's high unemployment rates, or there's a new stereotype we're calling the Cadillac Queens 2.0 of people coming here just to exploit the welfare system or just coming here to get health care. And once again, this reinforces this division between people, but also builds this construct of especially people from Latin American as violent, as just coming here to exploit the system, as taking something from the good voters of Arizona. It's really, really starting to heighten, and ultimately this reinforces those stereotypes that become incredibly problematic and incite a lot of fear in other people. Now, I can close today with what is kind of the most illuminating example of what I've been talking about this last time, or the last couple minutes here. It comes from Bill O'Reilly, and what he did was he went to a restaurant, a black-owned, black-operated restaurant in Harlem, and he had some interesting things to say about how he was surprised nobody was screaming, "I want more iced tea, MFer," and so forth. I'll just play this clip and let him put it in his own words.
I think black Americans are starting to think more and more of themselves. And they're getting away from the Sharptons and the Jacksons and the people trying to lead them into a race-based culture. You're not trying to figure out what I can make. If I work hard, get educated, I can make it. You know, I'm charged by it. It's a big promotion and everything, but everybody brings.
And I couldn't get over the fact that there was no difference between Sylvia's restaurant and any other restaurant. I mean, it was exactly the same. Even though it's run by blacks, primarily black patriotism. There wasn't one person in Sylvia's who was screaming, MF'er, I want more iced tea. You know, I mean, everybody was, Jim, it was like going into an Italian restaurant in an all-white suburb, in the sense of people were sitting there and they were ordering and having fun, and there wasn't any kind of craziness at all.
Okay, this example is incredibly interesting. There's a lot of things going on here. I've actually spent about 20 minutes in my intro class just dissecting this quote and the next one I'm about to show you. But we see from the social reaction of what he said, people were kind of outraged that he just kind of came in and said these horrific things about what he expected at this Harlem restaurant. And it was incredibly racially insensitive, and obviously he had a very, very distorted image of black folks going in here. But at the same time, we should ask ourselves, was he ultimately maybe some way trying to, combat some of those stereotypes in doing this? Maybe, maybe not. But interestingly enough, in the response to what this outrage or this outrage that was generated over these comments, in his response, there was a much, much more problematic construct in terms of all those numbers I just showed you a few minutes ago.
Now, the top story tonight, we are happy to have, for the first time in 11 years on the air, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, everybody. You know, I'm glad to see you. What were you trying to say? I'm saying the questions come up and there's no way the hours on how whites fear, many whites fear blacks. And fear drives racism, as you know. Fear drives. And I say to my audience, look, this is a restaurant like any other restaurant, but a lot of whites are afraid to go there. And you walk in there, it's just like any other restaurant, okay? It was framed in the sense that fear drives racism, and there's nothing to be afraid of.
One of the things that angry was really hatred that is about
Absolutely.
And so to underestimate the civility of blacks was insulting to me.
Who underestimated the civility of blacks?
That's how it came off. That's how it came off. It's like that if I were to go to a white restaurant, basic white restaurant, it's like I came out and see any Muslims, I can call them from the name. You say, of course not. Because I'm not in that sense underestimate their civility. That's what this kind of group is all about. What struck me more about this conversation about me on that statement was what was he doing that day. That's the same day. To put it on the verse of the resegregation like the
average.
When they ran the resegregation of our school system because of part tax-based funding, here we are trapped in the inner city's first-class schools, first-class and second-class schools. President Clinton was dying a little while now, also when I gave it back. We couldn't ignore it. The same day, a report came out which showed that blacks expelled a huge disproportionate rate of our population. And New Jersey, blacks expelled 60 times more than whites in the population, and in Texas, like 26. So issues of great substance, the desegregation challenge, the need to make an even playing field education, the issues of rate of crime, the jail system. So you really know what we're all about when you're thinking about civility and blacks in poverty.
Here's what's driving the expulsion, the crime, and the poverty in the black community. You want to know what's driving it? No fathers in the home. 70% of black babies are born out of wedlock in this country. 70% as opposed to 25% for whites. That's what's behind murder. That's what's behind all of these problems. And that's what has to be addressed.
I think in some sense, when you look at America with jobs out, discipline, and raising children, we would want to do that. Jobs out, investment out, jobs will grow up. We do not grow up when we not manufacture that. The always sell all that as legal there and force the growth trade. Taxes up, service down, first class, second class relation. There's a phenomenon here. The liberals have been marginalizing the whole bunch of American people. We want to take that seriously because in some sense, it costs more to lock up the
problem of the disintegration of the family in the African American community, all of these other things are not going to solve it. We're not going to solve it.
I'm targeting and we need to 17 young black males on Pennsylvania Street. And part driven by this excessive expulsion rate.
If they had a dad in the home, they would finish.
No, I'm not sure that dads in the home investigation have excessive expulsion rates.
Let's take a look at it.
And excessive, some say that do not correspond with crime.
Let's come back. We'll take a look at the Duke and the expulsion rate with Reverend Jackson in a moment.
So that's kind of the capstone to where these ideas can ultimately lead. We get these divisions pushed amongst people along racial lines. Maybe it's not done with intentional hatred like it used to be, or a belief in racial superiority, or the belief in a racial hierarchy. That's not really what sociologists see as causing these divisions anymore. But these divisions are, of course, still very, very, very real. And then what happens after these divisions? Well, that's where we start to get these different resources that come into play. Just as Reverend Jackson was talking about there, you get these segregated communities, and then you start to get divisions amongst them. You start to get differential investment. You start to get a difference in the schools. And then, of course, inevitably, you're going to start to get some of the problems that come associated with poverty. But then kind of the capstone on all this is these ideas just explicated in this video, where it's not like, oh, you're a criminal because you're black. No, the new idea is you're a criminal because your mother was promiscuous. The new ideology isn't like you use drugs because you're black. The new ideology is you use drugs because your father didn't teach you anymore. And of course, this is just, a fabricated way to come back and justify those numbers that I just showed you, instead of, actually confronting them, instead of actually dealing with them, and perhaps most specifically, dealing with them in an honest way without pulling back into these prejudices to explain everything and throwing our hands and just saying, there's nothing we can do, I give up. Thank you.
I have a question. From this book you're presenting, it sounds to me like what you're calling into racism really is political correctness. And I like your comment in that one about something I heard on NPR recently, where the N-word was about to be removed from textbooks, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But can you repeat that for me?
In terms of political correctness, oftentimes, at least sociologists look at political correctness as in terms of a barrier to actually confronting these, or as a barrier to where we just ignore racial problems because they're difficult to deal with. That's what we generally call political correctness, kind of like a cover for the fear to step up and actually start to confront these issues. That's how we use that word. I'm not sure how it was used on NPR in that context. In terms of censoring those words from those books, obviously that's very, very much part of our society that now reacts so strongly to those words. It's very, very, very much folded in. But at the same time, I kind of fall back to one of my scholar idols on this, Cornel West, who's up at Princeton, who says those words should be left in because they're important as a historical document. So I'm going to take his word on it just because I trust him on these matters, whereas I don't feel comfortable making a judgment on that.
My other comment is that my experience with political correctness is that it presents the best from looking at who causes and therefore correcting what you see on an individual level.
I hate to miss out. The political correctness stands as a barrier to be correct. Was that the way you put it?
Yes, correct the problem.
Correct the problem, yes. That is very, very much how sociologists look at it, in terms of just ignore the problem, it'll go away. We've been maybe kind of ignoring it, and it's not going away. So it's probably time to confront these and accept the fact we have racial discrepancies in our society, and we should start working on ways to overcome them if we are going to truly achieve this American dream of equal equality, equal opportunity for everybody. Yes, sir.
I thank you for the presentation. I want to say that stemming off of this comment about political correctness, I think it's fairly clear that our culture has become pretty obsessed with political correctness, such that there is this reaction to political correctness that some people feel. I've always thought of being politically correct, at least the good part of it is, addressing people how they prefer to be addressed, which seems a very respectful thing. Treating people how they wish to be treated seems to me to be a wise thing. Obviously, as a white person, I'm terrified of saying something that can be construed as racist, even if I know my intentions.
If I can give a speech.
Right. I don't want to make people feel that way. And so then we have this trepidatious territory that I think a lot of people have. But this leads me to my question. Bill O'Reilly is up there, and actually in the last segment there, even though I agree with you about, I think he's ignorant as to the larger social structures that are really holding progress back. At least in that last portion, I really felt he was being a lot more, honest about it and trying to represent the side from somebody who really thinks that he really does think he's confronting the real issue. He thinks that the real issue is fatherless homes. He really does. I agree with you that the real issue are these larger social and economic problems. How do we convince these people who are honest? I don't know that he's always honest, but there he seemed honest. How do we who think the way we do, convince these people, at least the people who are honest? I'm not sure Laura Schlesinger is honest. The people who are honest, who really do think that the only issue is fatherless homes. How do we bridge that?
The way I actually handle that in my intro classes, where I fortunately have an entire semester to deal with this, is we start the discussion out with poverty. And then we look at how poverty is actually what destroys these families. And then we get minority communities predisposed to higher rates of poverty. And then we can let people know they're not entirely wrong, that broken families can have effects on long-term growth. But if you reverse the causality to how it actually is and say, look, this is the consequence of the poverty, not poverty creates this consequence. If you can reverse it around, then you can make people feel better they weren't misled, but at the same time, you can start to attack one of the many social problems we do ultimately have. And if we could eradicate poverty and get people not in competition with each other, not dividing these lenses along economic lines, not making people feel like they're fighting for their jobs against immigrants or fighting for their jobs against affirmative action candidates, if we could get to that point, that would probably do more than any speech anybody could give to put the heat down on these very, very sensitive issues.
So going forward from this point on, how as possible future educators can we stop this indoctrination of subtle racism? What are some of the things that we can possibly do to help at a young age promote equality amongst all humankind?
The best thing we can possibly do is draw upon the wonderful diversity that we're starting to get at higher educations. We found through our studies the best way to actually overcome many of these resources is to have people prove them false by having meaningful, intimate, cooperative relationships with people of all races. That's really is the best way we can go about doing it. So just get people talking to each other. I mean, it can be a little scary because of political correctness sometimes too, but sheer interaction every day with my brilliant minority students, I'm reminded that that comment is bunk. Okay, every day I'm reminded of that, and I'm very, very fortunate to work with such great students of all races. So I'd say just let people know thoughts like this aren't quite accurate, and the best way to do that is through personal experience. Sorry.
I kind of missed your headline.
Okay.
Right, you have to talk louder.
Okay. The headline was New Racism in the Old South.
Yes.
It seems to kind of go into depth on comments made by different public figures and how racism has changed in America as a whole. And I wanted to know what you want to say about how things are now and what people would argue as the New South.
The New South. Okay, I did run out of time in my last slide here, which was focused specifically on the Confederate flag issue. What we are finding with the New South is it's the fastest growing area of the population, or I'm sorry, the fastest growing part of the country in terms of population. And what we have is people basically coming into what is still a very, very segregated state, very, very racially segregated. So we're starting to see these patterns kind of quantified throughout the entire country because this area is becoming so much more central to everything that's going on in our country right now. So some of these lingering problems that seem to be a little more exacerbated because of the history of this area, they definitely start to filter out everywhere, especially in terms of this, what we're calling the Southern Strategy 2.0. In the politics, it is getting very, very, very egregious in terms of throwing these stereotypes around against all different types of people. It's changing. If you want the full context, for the last 30 years, the Democratic-Republican split always occurred where Republicans charged Democrats as being elitist, as windsurfing, and we had Dukakis on the tank, as Ivy League type uppity, so forth. With the new way the Democrats are being constructed, it's very, very much acorn, socialist. We're coming after repatriation, and it's getting pretty ugly. That's what I didn't quite have time for. Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of along the same lines. I heard Nikki Haley say right before the election that I think someone asked her what the most serious problem was in South Carolina, and she said, we have a cultural problem. And she wanted to release the faith-based community to go into these communities and teach values. And so she was really using the same argument that Bill O'Reilly was, without mentioning race, without mentioning income, without mentioning anything. It's just like, we need to fix these families.
Yeah,
we need to do it without government money.
Yeah, a lot of times that's the implicit type notion, and that's been central for politics for 20-some years. There's always this construct of people are poor because they're lazy, unmotivated, and so forth, whereas sociologists know there's a lot of structural barriers that people face. Of course, class. Some of them are class where not your parents have money. Some of them are racial. Some of them are, gendered. So we definitely see that popping up. But oftentimes there's a coded language going on there. Mm-hmm. These communities usually refers to non-white communities. Or if we even flip it on the other side, we see this construct of Main Street America. Oftentimes that's implicitly white.
Like the real Virginia.
Or like the real Virginia, or not one of us. Well, who's not one of us? Well, it just happens to be everybody not white is not one of us. I don't know how that happened, so.
It's not one of us. I mean, you can take it that far. Anyone who is not me is not one of us.
Not me.
I mean, and the real Virginia has many, many analogs all over this country. I was born and raised in New York City. Everybody outside of New York City is from upstate. I get into a real argument with a good friend of mine from Syracuse.
I'm from Buffalo, upstate, right?
Those terms. But I think it's sort of implicit in the way people see the world. When it becomes a problem is when it gets to a point where you can't see the humanity in the other person.
Yeah.
But that's...
Not so much a question, but more so of a comment. How Bill O'Reilly was on there talking about, people are like this because there's no fathers in the home. It's sort of like the labeling theory. When you keep telling people this, they start to believe it. I actually know black people who say things like, oh, if my dad was around, maybe I wouldn't be having all these babies. Or, oh, if my dad was around, maybe I wouldn't be doing this. It's not an excuse. I don't see it as an excuse. Maybe I'd be less of one. White people on TV saying these sorts of things, powerful people like Bill O'Reilly, you start to believe it. They start to get it in the back of their mind, and they start to believe it and make it so.
The self-fulfilling prophecy.
Isn't that the point of them saying it?
Yeah, labeling theory, sometimes we call it othering, and it does sometimes create these self-fulfilling prophecies, or on the other hand, it can create justifications to just kind of give up. okay, without even trying. And that happens of people of all colors. Okay, I can take you back home in Hillbilly, Pennsylvania, where I'm from, and I'll find my old high school friends on the same bar I left them 10 years ago, and they do the same thing. So that's not really race specific, but it can become racialized, which is where we get the problem.
But I bet you Bill O'Reilly has to go to that bar and say, oh, you know, I expected them to, you know, be all yogi, but whatever.
He would probably be on the television, but he would have a good time there, maybe.
There is racism towards poor people, though, that does happen. So, you know, there's a lot of, like my friend from Tennessee, I mean, he always talks about when Northerners come down, they actually ask questions like, y'all got the internet down here? and he says, no, we just got running water in the back. So I object a little bit because I think it's not just an issue of race, I think it's an issue of class.
Well, that was my next question to him. Maybe talk about the economic and how my feeling is a lot of times people will use racism to divert people's attention to what's really going on in the economy.
Yeah, I focused up here more on how race is used to create these economic divisions, but in terms of the construction of the stereotypes, which I think we have going on here, they are very, very much at play. There's a scholar called Patricia Hill Collins who has this concept of intersectionality that is basically all about this notion how you can't disentangle class and race in many, many ways. The difference that often happens, however, is whenever you get poverty, it doesn't matter what race it is, you tend to get the same things. You tend to get the breakdown of the family, you tend to get substance abuse in, you tend to get alcohol problems, you tend to get crime and violence. That's regardless of color. However, what oftentimes happens is it gets minimized in the construction of whiteness. It's set down. Or at the same time, for many minority groups, they become pigeonholed entirely by that 25% who suffer in this egregious poverty. So whereas I had those numbers up earlier, I don't want to say the poverty rate for African Americans is only 25%, but if we took a survey of many people out there, I bet they would think it was 75, 80%. And that reinforces these stereotypes of not just the crime and the drugs, but also, well, you don't work hard enough. Your dad didn't care for you or something.
How much of that is a result of geographic segregation?
Geographic segregation is very, very key, both in the sense of the urban-rural divide that we have in this country, to where the rural small-town communities have basically been left to decay to nothing, and the inner cities. Well, some cities are being revamped, but many inner cities now, especially in the industrial Rust Belt where I'm from, Buffalo, New York, not New York, Buffalo, New York, Detroit, down the Mississippi, the old industrial base, just inner cities, decrepit, and that's where you get the urban type stereotype. The rural poverty of whites, that's where you get the Kid Rock, Larry the Cable Guy.
What prompted that question was, as I said, I'm from New York City, and I used to refer to, well, that's the black ghetto, that's the Jewish ghetto, that's the Italian ghetto, it's even worse in Chicago, If you live on a block where everybody looks and talks and sounds and believes the same way you do, how can you possibly begin to understand the other?
That's back to our point of interaction is very, very, very much the same. And going back to the question just a second ago about geographic immigration, there's a theory that's actually called American apartheid. And it basically says our failure to integrate after we legally desegregated, and because ironically enough, after legal desegregation, we actually became more residentially segregated. That theory argues that when we kind of go off into our own communities, that's what helps these stereotypes persist, because we're not meeting each other, we're not interacting, we're not getting these ideas thrust down through our personal experiences. And of course, you get the layer of economics back on top of this. Depressed areas, depressed tax base, bad schools, no jobs, more crime, more drugs, and the cycle repeats itself. Then we don't invest in these areas because of the prejudices, more crime, more drugs, no investment, prejudices, and just...
Is there a difference between Hispanic poverty and black poverty? Because everyone focuses, like Bill O'Reilly focuses on black poverty being part of, because there's no father in the house. But Hispanic poverty, Hispanics aren't known for the divorce rate or for single baby, single family homes. They're known for their family like tightness. And So since they have almost comparable poverty rates, I'm wondering what.
In terms of the actual experience, I wouldn't say it would differ that much in terms of depravity and so forth. However, given the way our immigration patterns work, and we are basically experiencing now the first generation of immigrants from primarily Latin America, oftentimes what happens with the first generation of immigrants is they retain a very, very strong connection to their heritage, and that actually builds strong communities for the first generation. So we'll have to. So that is different right now. We're not seeing massive dissolution in immigrant families, but we're going to have to see what happens in the next couple of generations after the children are partially assimilated into American culture, because generally the American family has disintegrated across the board. So that's not race specific either in many cases. 50% of all divorces, 50% of all marriages end in divorce across the races. So that is the difference for now, but we'll have to see how this plays out. Because it happened with the Irish too. The first generation stuck very, very close together, and then subsequent generations we had a falling into poverty.
I had a question and a comment. One, I do agree with you that it's a generational type of situation that's going on. How do you feel, because I know Soledad O'Brien did a follow-up to a study that was done years ago on the younger generation of children that are growing up with the same perceptions as far as skin color, racism. How do you feel that plays into actually addressing the issue? Because we are talking about a new generation that's coming up. And when you actually think about this whole, the issue entirely, you're dealing with a problem that goes to the heart of people. And that's actually the root. When O'Reilly talking about the root of the problem, it's the heart of people. So honestly, with the new generation coming up that are being raised by an older generation that are perpetuating these same ideas on them, do you honestly think that we will ever come to a point where racism is not even an issue?
Tough question. It's been with us for 5,000 years. I don't know if we'll ever get rid of it, but there is hope we could maybe overcome it in some cases. I mean, we just mentioned the Irish immigrants 100 years ago. The Irish immigrants were considered their own race, and they weren't allowed certain jobs, and they weren't allowed to hold office, and so forth. But through time, we've kind of assimilated the idea of Irish and Italian. What were once all these separate races, we've kind of blanketed them all into just this whiteness now. So we don't really see that anymore. So maybe there would be a case where we start not to see the racial differences we see right now. And in that case, we don't see them. They're not going to play as strong as an effect, because they really are all just a figment of our mind if we really want to bring it back to where it comes from. This whole idea of categorizing races is just something we do. It doesn't even actually make sense when you look at the genetics or the skin color or the facial features. When you look at the continuum of human variation in our physical sense, to where we put these arbitrary lines here and here, it really is quite profound why we even do that at all. So if we can not see it, maybe we can get over it. But as long as we see it, we're probably going to have effects from it, because us humans, wherever we get difference, we can't really accept difference. We like to order it. So we like to put one's better than the other, and that's where prejudices ultimately come from.
When I was young, racism in the South was very overt, and I think so much of that has disappeared. But what scares me is the covert racism, the quiet, and that's what we were just asking Crystal, if it's here on campus. I don't know where I live, but I wasn't so aware, but apparently it is. They're telling me it is. So I think there's this, what scares me more than anything is the sort of covert groundswell. Let's sort of talk about it, but it's there, we're going to reinforce it. Racism. And I find that much scarier than overt, because we could confront it. We could stamp our feet and speak to it, but it's hard now, I find.
Yeah, oftentimes the initial barrier is just convincing people that exist in the first place.
I find some problems because I think it is natural on a personal level to make certain decisions. Who are your friends? They're usually people who have a lot of commonality with you. for very good reasons. You'd be arguing with them all the time if you didn't. And maybe if you're argumentatious, yeah, it works. And I think what happens is that gets bent out of shape when you get into these racial issues. So what might be a normal preference, simply because you share a lot of background, a lot of likes and dislikes, becomes something much more codified.
Okay, however, though, sociologists do know oftentimes we're like people because we have similar experiences with them, and we're from the same environment, same socioeconomic class, and that's why we're alike. So once again, if we can get people more integrated, that would be a way to start chipping away at that natural way. Well, sociologists don't use the word natural, but that way we form in-groups and out-groups. And that, of course, entails a definition of we are like this, you are like that. And if we could stop right there, it'd be okay. But once again, we want to put the order on it, and that's where we get ourselves in trouble.
Have you ever heard the Southern definition of Yankees, damn Yankees, and goddamn Yankees?
Yes, I have. I don't want to repeat that one.